to introduce our outgoing President and new Vice President, Jerry Sampson, for his presidential address.
I think I answered Bill's 13 choices when we were discussing what subject would be appropriate. This, I think, was just the top one.
I got the top one, Jerry. I looked at the title and thought Anchorites. That's where they put their anchors in ships. You put me right there.
Let's change the content of it. I'm going to have to ask you to engage in some imagination, because we're going to look at a subject which I knew very little about 2 years ago, until I actually found what I'm pretty sure is alcohol. But I also need to engage in a little imaginative resource for you, because generally speaking, the view of the anchorite is of a mad nun walled up in the dark and left to die. And this didn't happen. This is not what an anchorite is. An anchorite is a male or female recluse who has chosen to become in retreat permanently, in effect. Our view of the anchorite has probably been coloured by the Reformation. That's presumably why we have the view of these people as unproductive, unworthy clods, to quote an Elizabethan commentator, doing no good to any man. These people were spiritual advisors to large areas of the community. They were the people who chose to take communal living within the monastic community to a greater level. These are true spiritual athletes. You sometimes hear them referred to as immured between life and death. Well, that's a strange way for the medieval mind to appreciate what they're doing, because they are not between life and death. They are between a meaningless worldly life, an exile in this world, and an eternal heavenly life. These people are saints in training. They have, in the words of the medieval commentators, chosen to live the life of angels. So you need to think less in terms of mad nuns in dark, dusty places, as people in permanent retreat attempting a major spiritual exercise. So, as I say, 2 years ago I knew virtually nothing about the Anchorite. This is a letter, 1436, written by the Abbot of Thorney to the Bishop of Lincoln, describing how they have enclosed an arm from the nunnery at Stainfield. We repaired to the parish church of Winterton on the 21st day of the month aforesaid to examine Beatrice Frank, the nun Stainfield, there awaiting our arrival, touching the withdrawal from the common life. That means the life in common within a nunnery, to the solitary life, concerning the length of time in this purpose, about the dangers for those making choice of such a life and afterwards regretting it. This is permanent enclosure. You do not come out. This is it. And on conclusion of the examination, without our finding that she vacillated or wavered in aught, that from youth she had longed without intermission for the anchoritic life, continuing all the time in the same purpose, we resolved the same, and gave release from the bond of obedience to the prioress of Stainfield. And on the 22nd of January, St. Vincent's Day, before the great altar of the church aforesaid, during the solemnities of Mass, she made and promised to us publicly, on behalf of yourself and your successors, a new profession of obedience. I think this is a mystery. Obedience and chastity. I think that's probably what should be there. Notice that the three links of poverty, obedience and chastity, poverty has been dropped. That's because the anchoress or the anchorite had to actually have a sponsor, had to have income in order to maintain their vocation. Read openly and distinctly. The Mass solemnly celebrated, as is the custom, after reception of the previous assent and consent of the people among whom she sojourns today. So it's with the consent of the people of the parish. We shut up the aforesaid Sister Beatrice in a certain house and enclosure constructed on the north side of the said church. Note the north side, it's important later. Making fast the door with bolts and bars and keys, leaving her in peace and quiet of spirit in the Saviour's joy. So this is a joyful thing. This isn't in any way a negative experience. There's been an awful lot of study of Anchorites over the last 10 years or so, but it's almost all been in terms of gender studies or of literary studies. The seminal work, Hermits and Anchorites of England, published 100 years ago. Mary Rocker Clay is also well known for her work on hospitals in the Middle Ages. Nothing much happened apart from an update of Mary Clay's work in 1955 until Anchorites and Their Patrons in Medieval England by Anne K. Warren, 1985. Both of these are largely based on documentary research. And in terms of the archaeology of the Anchor Hold, there are 8 pages in Roberta Gilchrist's Contemplation of Action, the other monasticism. So very little work had been done since 1995, up until 20 years or so. And as I said, a great deal more work has been done subsequently. For documentary background, we have the documents themselves, but we also have things like Anchor Noissa, which is a book of advice for anchoresses written in the 12th century. We have Aelred of Rievault's De Institutione Inclusarium, on the institution of enclosure, which was written for his sister, who was an enclosed nun, and Jocelyn of San Bertin, the Liber Confortatis, the book of encouragement and consolation. So those give some sort of insight into the lifestyle of the Anchorite, but actually very little in terms of what we can deduce about their living conditions. So, Clay and Warren, the total is 780 recluses. Now, there are 2 types, hermits and anchorites. Hermits don't have such a great degree of geographical fixity. They're allowed to wander about a bit. They're often found looking after bridges and roads and things of that sort. The anchorite is enclosed. They have permanent geographical fixity. They are in that building. So, of the 780 recluses, there are 601 sites, and as far as published examples of possible anchor holds, the actual buildings that the anchorite lived in, 27. Mary Rocker Clay was 12. The total goes up by 10 with Roberta Gilchrist, and there have been a few published subsequently. 27, less than 5%. How many anchorites were there? Well, they're fairly well documented, in large part because if an anchorite's income failed, the bishop and the diocese became liable for their support. So bishops were quite keen on actually getting records of everybody who was out there and making sure that they could actually pay the dues. So documentary evidence is pretty good, but it does require the survival of the bishop's register and the basic documents, which is not always the case. Anne Warren in 1985 say that it was a wide-ranging and far-reaching religious phenomenon. Many anchorites all over the country, not one in every parish, but in many. So 601 sites are probably not representative of the total number. Mary Hughes Edwards, writing more recently, 2012, the vocation was evidently more widespread than either Clay or Warren could have anticipated. So the realisation that there are an awful lot of them out there. And Tom Licence hermits and recluses in English society in 950 to 1200. Even if it had been possible to count them, no one did. So we can only entertain the most impressionistic estimates of their numbers. So how do we visualise the cell, the Anchorite? Well, we've got a few images in medieval manuscripts. Percival and the recluse, it's actually his aunt. It's from the Arthurian legends. Percival goes to visit his aunt, and you can see the nun at the grilled window. And you can see that the building is actually larger than you might imagine, particularly from the references that we have in the literature, and that it appears to have an ancillary building with a chimney, which is quite interesting. The picture of St. Wiberad and the Anchorite seer is more like the descriptions that we get in the literature. Small building, gabled, with a small window, just enough to be able to pass the materials out to St. Wiberad through it, and a barred door at the end. And on the other side of the Anchorite cell, the opening into the church. Because one of the key things the Anchorite needed to do was to be able to see the sacrament, to be able to see the moment of transubstantiation, when the host is lifted and transubstantiation takes place at the high altar. So one of the key ways of recognising possible traces of the Anchorite cell in a church is to find the presence of a small squint, keyed from the outside and pointed at the high altar. Some things that we can learn from the contemporary descriptions, things like Amprena Vis, you would never be able to recover from archaeology. Things like the fact that it is advised that the window through which the Anchoress or the Anchorite communicates with the world, there should be a black cloth with a white cross on it. And he says in the text, the black cloth also teaches an emblem. Now, the emblem that he describes is actually to do with colour symbolism. But one thing that he doesn't mention, probably because it was so obvious that nobody would imagine that it could go without being recognised, is the fact that a black cloth with a white cross on it is also the pall that is laid over the coffin at the time of burial. Because the Anchorite is dead to this world. You are talking through the barrier of death when you speak to the Anchorite. This is somebody who is withdrawn from this world. Ain't got no home in this world anymore, as the Gospel says. So, how do we recognise the cell? Very rough clays gives what is actually a pretty good way of assessing the evidence. Traces of the anchorage, just another word for anchorage, then may reasonably be sought near the chancel. It might be an upper room, but a chamber in the tower over the porch is a most unlikely for the recluse. Since the term leper's window has become discredited, there is a tendency with some to describe an inexplicable low-side window as an Anchorite squint. It is well to bear in mind that even where a habitable room exists, with fireplace, seat or bookrest, it may have been a sacristy or a priest's lodging. There is abundant opportunity for research on this subject, and it is much to be desired that architecture follow up the clues supplied by records. Well, not a lot happened after that, but one of the most important points that she's making is that you have to take account of other possible reasons for things. Just finding a squint is not sufficient. You need to think hard about how this is actually going to work. And we also need to try and visualise what the Anchorite itself is like. Roberta Gilchrist is the only person that I know of who's done sensible work in terms of the archaeology of these buildings. She says evidence for anchor holes was compiled by antiquaries who stripped render unblocked openings in search of low-side windows with the mythical letter squints in chancel walls. We'll be looking at Johnston's work in a minute in the case study. Once piqued, their curiosity often led to digging in the area of the Anchorite cell. Unfortunately, such pastimes were seldom recorded accurately or even at all. We therefore have little evidence on the average dimensions of anchor holes, the nature of their construction, or whether they were surrounded by a garden enclosure. We have no evidence of artifacts or food remains associated with their cells, or whether they were provided with guardrails or drains. The nature of the anchor hold and the standards of living of their incumbents is surely one area in which church archaeology still has much to contribute. Those two comments are probably the best two quotes about the archaeology of the anchor hold that I could give you. And there is a lot of misinformation out there, and some of it is quite modern. So Tom Licence's book, 270 pages, the section headed archaeology is just under 2.5 pages, so it's 1%. He says, archaeological remains suggest the vast majority were lean-to timber structures, rather than solid domiciles of stone which first come into view in the 14th century. Archaeological remains are no such thing. Knowing that this is true, no universal template for reclusive cells existed, perhaps for the reason that no single authority regulated. And that makes life very difficult because things can be difficult. It's not easy to recognise what we've got. Most were probably designed in accordance with the tastes and specifications of their first occupants or patrons. Osborne and Jocelyn assumed that recluses built their own cells. Archaeology indicates that doing so would have required very little skill. Sorry, but I don't agree. Osborne and Jocelyn assumed that recluses built their own cells. That is a bit like saying the bishop has built a cathedral. My suspicion is that elderly female upper-class incumbents are probably not skilled carpenters, and certainly not skilled stonemasons. Archaeology indicates that doing so would have required very little skill, although we'll look at that. Jones describes the cells more often abutting than named, the part of the church that was preserved for the laity of the chancel, which was the priests. Citing Gilchrist as his source, these examples actually give 16 chancel sites out of the overall total of 22. So that is simply untrue. And because it's a recent quotation, Pauline Matarasso, whose superb translation of the Life of Walker of Hazelbury, and Hughes Edwards' recent work has also quoted it. It is not the case. These are the 27. I'm not going to read them out, I'm not going to go through this list in any way. All I've done is to put arrows against the ones that I think have some merit. So out of the 27, I've got 10 that have probably got some merit, and 2 which have got a high chance of actually being part of the scheme. So what do we see? We see things like this. This is a photograph of the discovery of the squint in the exterior of the north side of the chancel, pointed straight at the high altar at Linsell in Essex, the interior view of it. This is Bengio. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a very strange place now. Here we have a doorway, which is probably late, a squint, and 2 large sockets. And this is the sort of thing that James is saying we don't need very much skill for. He's saying these are wooden things, 2 big sockets, just a couple of props under the end. This is for a roof structure. It was almost certainly a stone-built thing. These are the 2 ends for the roof trusses. So it's probably a stone-built structure. This is Leatherhead. This is Philip Mannering Johnson, referred to by Gilchrist earlier in the quote. This is the second of his anchor holes, and I simply don't believe it. If you've got a squint, then it's splaying from the Anchorite cell to the interior, not vice versa. That's a window. There's the top of it. It's much too high. It's above the doorway. The person operating that squint would be kneeling. They would not be able to use that. This is nonsense. This heavy wall probably indicates that it's a sacristy. So, this is Philip Mannering Johnson's first discovery of an Anchorite cell. And I think this one has a lot of merit, but not actually in the way that Mannering Johnson translated it. Because because what he said of it was almost certainly it was only a light erection of wattle and door, some 8 feet square internally, and roof was re-thatched from the rear. Here's our evidence. Squint. Nicely angled. Down here, cut-through window, 14th century window. So earlier than 14th century squint in a 12th century wall. Harden's one of these wonderful West Sussex painted churches. And here is his projected area for the Anchorite cell to operate. Now, we're very lucky at Harden because 2 things have happened since 1899. One is that they did some work on the drains in 1978, and the other is that they drew the building when they stripped plaster in 1981. And that is the view with the squint, cut by the 14th century window. There are some things wrong with their interpretation, even just looking at it without actually seeing the building. One of the things that is wrong is that this area, which is presumably for the insertion of the squint, also contains the material for the blocking of the squint. So they've conflated at least 2 very major phases of construction. I also doubt whether the upper part of the wall, that's more likely to be something to do with a 19th century repair, is anything to do with the introduction of the 14th century window. And one thing that is quite clear when you look at the fabric is that you've got herringbone occupying this area and very little herringbone elsewhere. So something has happened here, and it's happened on a vertical line. My suspicion is that that belongs to the insertion of the window, and that we're looking at a cut here. One of the things that has clearly happened is the insertion of this window. So if you want to know what the elevation on the south side looked like when the window wasn't there, have a look at the north side. So here we have the south side and the present north side, and all I've done is flip that, rotated it, so that you can see where that window operates in relation to this broken fabric. If you extend that line up and project it onto that, it just misses the window. My guess is that this is the edge of an inserted wall. You're looking at the point at which the east wall of the Anchorite cell intersected the fabric. If we've got the east wall, where's the west wall? Well, I don't know whether you can see it in this slide, but just there we've got 2 vertical breaks, which almost certainly represent the edge of the inserted wall. And then you have 3 blocks, 1, 2, 3. Go to the next slide, you can see the positions. Those are bonder stones. Those are the bonding stones that take the outer face of the wall. So we can reconstruct the position of the 2 walls. This is not an 8-foot flimsy structure made of wattle and door. This is a concrete masonry structure. Unfortunately, the excavations that were undertaken missed it by about 3 inches. The actual line goes halfway down this, and you can see that they've only excavated the eastern half. That bulk at that position, if it had come 3 inches further, would probably have hit into the lower trench or the fragment of the wall. So that's what we've got. We've got a much larger building. In fact, Manor and Johnson's 8-foot square just doesn't work. You can't actually fit an Anchorite into it to use that squint. The Anchorite would have had an altar of their own, kneeling in front of the step, which was almost certainly there, and looking through there, they would have been exactly aligned onto the position of the priest raising the host at the moment of transubstantiation. So we've got bigger buildings than the previous literature suggests. So what I want to present for the second part of the talk is the work that we've been doing in the southwest, in part to look at the documented ones, because the obvious thing to do to identify anchor holes in the southwest is to look at places where we have the documented evidence and then go and have a look at the fabric and see if there's anything there. 21 sites listed by today. I've just been given a 20-second portrait, which I will look into in due course. Of the 21 sites, all but 5 are hermitages, which doesn't help us. What I want to look at is the things in churchyards, these things against the north side of the chancel, which the previous commentators have looked at. Of those 5, we have Crewton, Durston, Hazelwood Bucknet, Chapel at Oath, Twerton St Michael. Only 2 still survive with medieval fabric. Twerton is a rebuild, Durston and Oath are gone. We have Hazelwood Bucknet, and we have Crewton. Hazelwood Bucknet was the home of Walfric, Saint Walfric, to local belief, but never actually canonised. He was regarded pretty much as a saint in his own lifetime. So Henry of Huntingdon, writing in 1135, when he still had another 20 years of enclosure to go, says the story of Walfric is attested by those who have seen parts of the halberd. This was his great miracle. He wore a chainmail shirt next to his skin, as good hermits should, and it was too long. And rather than have it sent back to the members, he had the sponsor, the local lord, come round and said, "It's too long. Send it to the members." No. Don't send it to the members. I don't want a couple of sheep shear for this. If you bring it round, I'll just sit round. In fact, what do you use? And so the royal man was given this pair of sheep shears and a chainmail halberd, and miraculously he was able to do so. This is a blunt set of shears. And these became, the rings from this became much sought after relics. In fact, after his death, they were virtually the only relics that have probably been exhibited. So, those who have seen parts of the halberd, or visited his delightful presence, or heard his desirable speech, or have freely sought out the religious life and become religious themselves, and it also spread amongst all the people, and is commonly known everywhere. So it's very famous. By the 1230s, the cult was sufficiently established that Roger of Wendover could say that innumerable miracles are being performed there even up to this day. And William of Worcester was well aware of this. Wildfric the priest lies in a church between Yeovil and Crowthorne. At this place lived the holy hermit and prophet Walfric in King Henry I's days. King Henry I and King Stephen. That Walfric was quite rude to King Stephen when he came to visit him. In the Martyrology of Sion, which is 16th century, in England the feast of St Walric, a priest born 8 miles from Bristow, that's Compton Martin, that in youth was very wild and a great hunter, and yet after he clothed himself as an anchor, and was of high perfection and many miracles. And locally the cult survived sufficiently that when John Gerard wrote his history, published in 1633, said that they will tell you many strange stories of St Walfric, which I'd rather you should inquire of the inhabitants than look for here. It's quite possible that Walfric is represented on the west front of the cathedral, because there are 4 hermits above the south aisle door, and these are the 2 from the upper part. Whether either of them are Walfric or not, I couldn't tell. Now, the life of Walfric was written by John Ford, probably about 1184, which would be about 15-20 years after Walfric died. And it's a very good piece of journalism. He's not up for wonderful, miraculous stories, though he does talk about miracles. A lot of what he talks about is very mundane, and it's well researched, and he gives all his sources. So he says, I got this story from so-and-so, and you got this story from Osborne the priest, and so forth. And you can actually begin to reconstruct the appearance of Walfric's living quarters from the incidental parts within the life. This is from Pauline Matarasso's commentary. As alcohols went, the one at Hazelbury was of reasonable size and consisted of an inner cell where the holy man lived and an outer room for the use of his servants and his visitors. So this is obvious when you think about the point of geographical fixity. Somebody has to go to Sainsbury's. This domus, as John terms it, is not described, but can be roughly reconstructed from the stories. It stood to the north of the chancel, the colder side, and the furthest removed from normal comings and goings of parishioners, but also on my right hand, because the high altar within the church is the presence of Christ, and the Lord is on my right hand. So it has a symbolic meaning as well, I suspect. On a site now incorporated in the extended and largely rebuilt church. Close to the sanctuary on the one side, jutted out into the graveyard on the other, its occupant entombed between life and death. There we go again. This is somebody who is writing from a very positive view, and yet still talks of this in terms of entombment. The cell proper had a raised altar against the east wall with a step in front, just as I've tried to reconstruct it, pardon. And to the left of that, a chest containing whatever the holy man possessed of value. In the north wall was a window. The cell would have been furnished with a table and a couple of stools, Walfrid able to eat his meals, which he occasionally shared with a chosen friend. He also read and copied books, though possibly as a lector. The bed, consisting of a wattle hurdle, took up little space and could be propped against the wall. It's a bed sitting with an altar. Elsewhere, probably in the north wall, was a door to an earth closet with cellular necessary room, and between the inner and outer cell was a shuttered window which he opened when a visitor knocked. In the outer cell, referred to by John as vestibulum cellular suae, and which may have extended the domus westward along the nave, his servant prepared his food, was probably expected to sleep, and served any visitors who might be offered hospitality. Here also a scribe when he employed on work. Here, above all, his visitors sat and communed with him, made their confession, confided their troubles, and listened to his pithy words of wisdom. The outer cell must have been large enough to allow for a trestle table and benches, since the holy man insisted one day on feeding a noble woman and all her retinue. Unless, of course, it was summer and these they had outside, but guests were not infrequent. This room had a door to the outside, to which his servant held the key, and which he locked behind him whenever he went out. In the inner cell, the one against the church, a door led into the parish church of Hazelbury, dedicated to St. Michael and all angels. Walfrid passed freely in and out, often spending the night in prayer before the altar of St. Michael. So it's a well-policed, enclosed complex of buildings. It's not just the anchor hall. In fact, there are references in the life to the presence of a stable, almost certainly so that the servant could get to Sainsbury's, or in this case, could get to Montacute Priory, which provided the food for Walfrid's support. Now, when Edmund Wright visited Hazelbury Front Church, it was a different building to what we see today. And the key line is actually at the bottom. This aisle, that's Walfrid's aisle. That's the north side of the chancel, the chapel on the north side of the chancel. It's a very narrow church, only 21 feet wide, consisting of nave, chancel, north aisle, which is the chapel against the north side, and a porch. And the aisle runs parallel with the chancel and is divided from it by two mitred arches. This is the present form from the not on yours, but on mine. This is a rebuild done by Samson Kempthorne in 1828, 1829. Originally, wall there. This is all new. Wall there, this is all new. So, the only tiles that weren't rebuilt by Samson Kempthorne at that time were the tower and the chancel with its chapel, and that's almost certain because they'd already been rebuilt about 3 years before. So, all of the fabric has gone. Unfortunately, Butler came along too late to record the original appearance. Slight changes. Butler draws 4 windows in the Walfrid aisle. There are only 3 there now, so there's been some alteration. But what we're looking at is a rebuild of the 19th century, which is gravely unfortunate. The two arches into the chancel are now one arch into the chancel, and the arch into the aisle almost certainly wasn't there when Black was present. What I think is that this arch is an entire fiction of the 1820s, and that this arch is one of the reused ones which were prepared in that position. When you look at the arch into the chancel, you have a reasonably medieval jamb. You have completely replaced caps and shafts and bases. The same on the other side, and the face of that part of the arch is also modern. So that's been entirely renewed. All we have, the Wolfwick cell, is that. And in fact, we probably don't have that from Wolfwick cell, because Wolfwick cell appears to have been converted into wonderful world of Wolfwick sometime in the 1170s to 1200s, so that pilgrims have a focus for their devotions. Because what you have with two arches into the chancel is nothing like the single door which Wolfwick used in the 1130s to the 1150s. What they've done is they have created visitor throughput. They have taken down the old wall, they have given you an entrance where you can go in and see fragments of the Holy Hallberg. You can come out the other side and visitors just pass around. It's world of Wolfwick. It's nothing to do with what Wolfwick actually did. And the reason for thinking that the arch in the west wall of Wolfwick's aisle is recited is because if it had ever been external, it wouldn't have the paint traces on it, which it does now. So you have red paint on the cap, you have paint in the angle of the abacus, and you have actual lining on the arch. Any better look at Kruger? It's got a good history. Ottolina was somebody that told John Ford about stories about Wolfwick at Hazelbury, Wolfwick at Pure Granny. So Ottolina was there before Wolfwick died in 1156. There was a second female anchorite in 1176, so Ottolina probably died shortly before. Then we've got a big gap until 1398, Stephen the Recluse. 1402, Richard the Child. 1459, Joan the Anchorite petitions to be released from her vow to abstain from meat on the grounds of infirmity. And then in 1523, the priest leaves 3 and 4pence and a pair of sheets to both the anchoress and the hermit. And Thomas Gerard tells us that in the churchyard at the west end of the church stands a little cell in which an anchoress was immured, and not far from it another cell for a hermit. So we've got both a hermit and an anchoress at the west end of the church. We don't know for certain that it actually abutted the church, but there's a possible evidence that it did so. We also have from the documents, I might skip that one actually because we're a bit short on time. A warning from Kruger is that if you have just documents about the presence of an anchorite cell, there is an automatic grasping at any star on the building as being evidence for its former presence. Kruger has 3 ancillary buildings which have gone. This is the most obvious one. It's a sacristy at the east end, 2 doors. This is a later surround defining the area of a family burial plot. There is another area on the east side of the south transept, and local belief is that the area between those 2 buttresses is to do with the anchorite itself. It isn't. It's a defaced niche for the figure sculpture. There's nothing whatsoever to do with the anchorite. So it's at the west end that we need to look. We have to ignore the 2 obvious ones. At the west end, if there's going to be anything abutting the church, it clearly can't be at the centre because it will block the door. So it has to be on one or other of the aisles. You can probably just see that there's a vertical grate there. But I think that matches the vertical break there, and they're both to do with the way that the building was constructed, with the aisles being added to the pre-existing nave. What is of interest is that on the south side, you have a recessed area of stonework where something is clearly abutted. These two, coloured in red, are 19th century replacements, so they won't have any trace of anything worth knowing about. This is the construction break that I pointed out before, and in front of it there is an area of paving which doesn't match the rest of the paving. We know that the Anchorites building stood until 1700. When they took it down, I'm wondering whether they sold off the footprint of it as a family burial plot, and that what we're seeing is actually a family burial plot which is perpetuating the position of the Anchorite cell. That's all we can offer at printers. There are two early engravings. Butler shows nothing. Hay and Day do show railings, which could be associated with that area of Hayward. One that we can cross off, this is Joan Cooper wrote a fictional history of Colburn. It's the best of them. And it's got into the mainstream. I looked at this, there is some destruction here, something has happened, but this little window is splayed the wrong way. It's a window, it's probably for lighting a reading desk or something of that sort. So I think we can be rid of Colburn. Axbridge is not Nottingham, but it has some merit. Colonel Bramble, 1902, members of the Society around the church, and said that he thought that we had an Anchorite cell. Carry on the next slide. Sorry to interrupt. And he said there are more of these things than you imagine, which is quite right. What we have is a splint, which is cut by a piscina, which is cut by the door, and there's a lean-to roof up there. Now, the lean-to roof respects the quite late north aisle, and I suspect that that is part of a later arrangement, and that we're not actually seeing the roof that belongs to the splint. Close up. There's the script, you can see it quite clearly cut by the door. Here's the interior of the door, and then it's the interior face of the screen, which just runs into the back of the piscine. The scene is clearly cut, you can see the hole down there, it's hard. So, there we have the possibility of an Anchorite cell with a squint, substituted with a chapel, or possibly an Anchorite cell for a priest who can celebrate Mass himself and therefore needs a piscina, and then substituted with a sacristy. Right away is what started with this. Here we have hedging scope, password for a swim, and quite clearly low level. And look what it's done to the fenestration. You have two rationally placed windows on the south side. The north window has been shunted eastwards by the presence of the splint. That's because a wall gets in there, coming out this way. Now, Ridgeway is very interesting. It's not there anymore. It was redundant in 1888 because the village had moved to the A38, and by 1940 it was semi-derelict, and it was drawn by Sir George Oakley's architectural practice. These are drawings from that period. 1964 it was acquired by Rolls-Royce as part of the manor. They converted the manor house to a conference and hospitality centre, and the church is virtually gone. All that's left is the west tower and the north wall. So this area is entirely lost. So work has been done there, and Tim Darwell has suggested that it's built on a tumulus site, and they've got residual Roman pottery from the site, and as a result they did some geophysics. is the geophysics trace, and it's quite interesting. I don't know whether you can see it, but on the north side of the chancel, you have some interesting shadows. And on a good copy of the trace, if you actually set things up, you have what looks very suspiciously like the sort of arrangement that we see below. You have the domus itself, and you've got a line across which would correspond with the step in front of the altar, and you have what is clearly a second building to the north, which could be the vestibule. You also have a door trace here, which could perhaps be the Cella Necessariorum. Now, when you look beyond Wolfrich's description to the description of the buildings in Anchorites, you get the impression that it's actually an even bigger complex for the greater anchor hall. That you not only have the servants' quarters and the Anchorites' quarters, you also have the parlour as well, a third building. Now, Pastor Francis is American and doesn't know what a church plan looks like in England, so his position is far too far to the west. They should be up here. The squint should be straight to the high altar. The private altar will, of course, not face south, but face east, so it will be there. The bed can come over here. Things need to be done here, but in essence, what it's suggesting is three buildings. And when you look even closer at the roadway trace, you might actually have three buildings. Servants' room, the vestibule and the domus, with the necessary room stationed between all three and accessible to all three, and policeable simply by the out into the loo, then open that door and out through the window of the vestibule. But it's very easy to police, you simply have the latch on the outside and can't get out. One of the other things that we don't know about these buildings for sure is the extent to which they had gardens. And it's just conceivable that this line over here represents an enclosed garden, and that the hermits of the Anchorite had access to the choir and could go out through the priest's door into an enclosed garden to the south. Now, just in case you think that I'm making too big a case on the basis of a few shadows on the geophysical survey, we put a test pit in to see if we've got the east wall of the anchor hole, and that looks to me like the east wall of the anchor hole. That's exactly where we expected it to be. I did a little piece of work at Hirelington, and when I finished talking to the architect, he said, well, I think you understand that St. Quintin's an interesting little church. You might like to have a look at the carved work in the south arcade. Yeah, that sounds good. And we walked across the churchyard and we saw that. And I thought, that ain't no north transept. That's much too small for anything that I know of except. It's a strong possibility that we are looking at surviving anchor hole. It has strong resemblance. There it is, just tucked on the north side. Everything clearly respects that window. It's not a north transept, it's an ancillary building, secondary. Quite clearly it had an altar. The window's been kicked high by the presence of the altar and its root table. This area is actually a repair. There was a window there. That would be the window which opened either to the parlour or to the exterior for communication. And you have a portal window in the west wall which provides light but not a view. And it looks an awful lot like the representations that we have from the literature. So where do we take it? A lot of warnings that I've put up so far, warnings against taking seriously the lightness of these structures. The likelihood is that they are complex of buildings, of which we are unlikely to see anything except a converted domus. Domus might be useful. It could, as we've seen at Axbridge, be morphed into something else. But morphing it into something else is likely to erase the traces which they anchor on. So, possible method. Visualising the buildings as depicted in documentary sources in order to understand their form and hence to identify the traces which they may have left on the standing structure of the church to which they are attached. We've looked at that, that's the background so far. Rigorous application of the principles of building archaeology and the analysis of church fabric to identify and determine the status and phasing of the surviving evidence. The sort of thing that outlined as Harden, where you actually look at the fabric in detail in order to be able to see where things fit on. Together with the recognition of the variations in the possible form of the anchor hold and of the vicissitudes which the surviving evidence may have undergone, and of the other possible practical and liturgical functions which could account for that evidence. How do you tell the difference between a priest's house and an anchor hold, for instance? And the key thing which wasn't available prior to our generation, the use of geophysical survey to determine the extent of lost ancillary buildings where there is strong evidence for the previous existence and position of the anchor hold, perhaps the sole method of identifying the form and extent of the greater anchor hold, because we are unlikely to see these separate ancillary buildings. A good case has been made at Old Willingham in Cambridgeshire for this as a possible anchor hold. I'm not sure I believe it. There's no trace of ancillary buildings on the string courses. You would expect to see something plugged in. They may have been repaired. That's why we need to use buildings archaeology to look and see, are there slots through there where the ancillary buildings of the greater anchor hold could have fitted on. To what extent is there a parallel, for instance, with communal Anchoritism, which is effectively what the Carthusian monasteries were, each individual having their own cell and garden, I stress. Are we looking at an institutionalisation of the average anchor hold when we look at the Carthusian cells? Carthusian cell itself, with its garden, 3 rooms, living rooms, actually probably considerably more complex than the Anchorites cell in the churchyard, but are there parallels? Also to look at fabric from the point of view of how the anchor hold impinged upon it. Roberta Gilchrist has suggested that the Tarrant Crawford Anchorite cell may well have stood on the south side of the nave because there are no windows. So the previous building there, the windows blocked up because something is standing outside. And a lot of the later documented anchor holds appear to be 2-story buildings. Is there a move away from the complex of the Walfrick style anchor hold to something more like a chantry priest? This is Wath in Yorkshire, which has a building which strongly resembles descriptions of later anchor cells. And of course, just to keep trolling for the typical example of the squint on the north side of the chancel, in this case with the doorway, contemporary, we need to look at these. Again, the suggested size of the anchor hold I think is much too small. It's much more likely that it is butted against the east end of the aisle. There are a lot of things out there on the web, a lot of people making claims, a lot of them without merit, but some with some merit, for the presence of Anchorites against their buildings. There is a lot more work to be done out there, and in trawling the web, some of the things you find
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy.
Does anybody have any questions for Joe?
Just one. Can you draw any conclusions, for instance, if they came between 2-story building and 1-story building?
My suspicion is that this is a historical development. You start with the sort of greater anchor hold, which takes up quite a lot of the churchyard, which probably wouldn't have been terribly popular with the village. Although it would be a great sort of boost to your locality to possess an anchor hold, it's going to impinge quite a lot on the graveyard. When you read later life stories, there's one with about 1,300 from Belgium, and we can't really argue from continental examples. But in that instance, a visitor comes and the anchoress comes downstairs. So at that point there is certainly a two-storey building. And my suspicion is that this is a historical development. When we've only got 27, of which 10 are likely, it's difficult to make global conclusions. But one of the sort of the working hypothesis at the moment is you start off with the greater Anchorite complex in the churchyard, and you develop into a two-storey sort of living quarters. The most famous one, and I've not been there, so I can't really comment on it, is Chester Street, which is a two-storey building against the west end of the North Nave Isle, which actually has 4 rooms. So, as I say, working hypothesis at the moment is that you have this developmental sequence.
I want to comment on that. You showed us two examples of Cooper, and but there is a very old, of course, Rhodes one, but it doesn't show the areas of the original. It's the burial ceremony, an interment, and it's along sort of the south side of the church, going towards the sort of area, gathering of people. I think that's about 17 years from now.
But it doesn't show.
No, it doesn't show that.
No, this is the really
wrong
annoying,
angle.
really annoying thing.
Absolutely.
We know that this thing, it was certainly there in 1700. Any views of the church at that day? No, not really.
It will be hidden by the end of the end buttress.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes out of this is the fact that if you have an anchorite in situ, and you come to rebuild the church, what do you do with the anchorite? And it's just one of the reasons perhaps why chancels seem to be less rebuilt than others. So that anchorite, so.
If I ask you to hold for, the people didn't get rid of the the other thing that struck me that you mentioned about the chest for their possessions. That's something they wouldn't have had in their community.
No, this is why I pointed out.
So I wondered about when you have the clear continuity of occupation. Did those go to the next Anchorite?
Anchorites, this is why I pointed out that obedience, chastity, and poverty.
Yes.
Poverty drops. They actually do have possessions, and you quite often see things being left by an anchorite to somebody else, because they are actually being given monetary gifts quite often. That's one of the warnings in the books of advice, is not to become obsessed with your income. In fact, you're not allowed to keep a cow. You have a cat. Go out, let the cat out and bolt it in. You can see what it was, a cow cat was raised on
following on from about the butlers, if you're using the butlers in a heritage centre, remember that they are finished artistic pieces. Butlers' original drawings are by the British Library, and it is quite often there are distinctions, not so much in churches, more with the other buildings, where he will put rules on ruins and so on, but I mean, a little about the windows, it might just be worth checking the original drawing. You might have thought symmetry looks better.
Yes, that's right.
There's one very back. I just want to say very quickly that now that you've spoken about this, Jerry, people will be starting to look with a bit more. So, yeah,
reporting anchorites who may encounter some.
Perhaps a couple more.
Is there any documentary evidence of the removal of anchorites or destruction of
Reformation or
yeah,
yeah, there are a few. One, I'll see if I can find it later on, but there is a lovely one where it says they are out now. But there are various ones where the community so much respect their anchorites at the Reformation that they last on. They continue in their actual place of residence, and they aren't got rid of in any way at all. There is, I think I can find it quickly.
We are running short of time, Jerry.
You mentioned that in some cases the sponsorship would fail and the church had to take over. Are there many documented references to that sort of thing?
There aren't. The vast majority of them were well underwritten. I can't think of... There are a couple where the Crown is actually the source of support. And there are a couple of letters saying you haven't paid me for 18 months. That's the one to look at, Anchorites and their patrons. That would certainly give you chapter and verse on that. But it's actually quite rare. And even rarer are Anchorites who run away. There's only one instance in the entire Middle Ages. These are very dedicated people who do what they have set themselves out to.
One very last question. It's really a question Bill should be asking about the etymology. Anchorites. What's the I mean, it's something in a ship which holds flats. Yeah, presumably it's flats. You should think about
I suspect it is. I mean, they do use the word anchorage
yes,
in the same sense as they use